After I retired from teaching high school biology, I moved to a modest home just outside Santa Rosa, California. Not because I had family here, my daughter Lauren lives out in Boston, but because I needed a place that felt gentle, quiet, warmer than Ohio winters, and far from the noise I'd grown tired of. My days became simple. Mornings started with coffee and classical music. Afternoons were spent tending a little raised bed garden I built in the backyard. Tomatoes, mostly, some lavender, a few herbs. I joined a local book group at the library, mostly women, all lovely, and I started volunteering twice a week at a food pantry downtown. It filled my time, and for a while, that was enough. But there was still something missing, not in a dramatic, aching way, just a kind of emptiness. A chair across from mine that stayed empty too often, a story I wanted to share, but had no one to hear it. So when my neighbor Eleanor, who organizes community socials in our neighborhood, mentioned she knew someone I might enjoy meeting, I was open, cautious but open. She said, "Her name's Marianne. She's 63, retired therapist, smart, kind, independent, like you." Then she gave me her number, smiled like a matchmaker, and walked off to water her succulents. And just like that, the seed was planted. It took me a couple of days to dial the number, not because I was afraid of rejection. At my age, rejection doesn't sting the way it used to, but because it had been so long since I had made that kind of call, the kind where you put a little hope on the line. When I finally did call Marianne, she picked up with a voice that sounded warm but measured. We talked for about 20 minutes, just enough to exchange stories without going too deep. She told me she'd been widowed almost 10 years ago and had spent most of that time focusing on her son and her practice. I told her about my teaching career and about Lauren, who worked as a nurse on the East Coast. I mentioned that I liked jazz, grew tomatoes, and that I was better at reading than I was at small talk. She laughed softly and said, "Same here." By the end of the call, we agreed to meet for coffee that Saturday at a local cafe called Maple and Pine, a cozy little place with big windows and too many kinds of milk alternatives on the menu. I hung up feeling surprised, not excited exactly, just gently hopeful, like maybe something kind was ahead. That Saturday morning, I got up early, shaved a little closer than usual, and wore a navy sport coat I hadn't touched since Lauren's wedding. I arrived 15 minutes early, ordered a cappuccino, and found a spot near the window where the morning light spilled in just right. Marianne arrived on time, exactly as promised. She wore a sage-green sweater and simple gold earrings. Her silver-streaked hair was tucked neatly behind her ears. She smiled and said, "Hi, Raymond," like we'd met before in another life. We sat, we talked, and for the first 30 minutes, it felt like exactly what I'd been missing. Easy, steady, human connection. We swapped stories about our careers, our routines, and how quiet the evenings can feel when you're used to a full house that's suddenly empty. She told me she had started taking watercolor classes and loved making Italian food. I told her about the time I accidentally planted ornamental kale instead of edible, and didn't realize it until I cooked it and nearly broke a tooth. She laughed. I relaxed. For a moment, it felt like something was blooming, but as the conversation turned more serious, so did Marianne's tone. She leaned in a little closer, folded her hands on the table and said, "I think it's important to be honest about expectations, up front." What came next changed the entire mood and set me on a path I never could have anticipated. At first, I appreciated her directness. At our age, beating around the bush is rarely productive and, frankly, exhausting. I nodded and said, "I agree, no reason to pretend." She smiled and replied, "Good, then I hope you'll understand that I've thought a lot about what I want at this point in life." That's when she reached into her handbag and pulled out a small notepad. She wasn't joking. She flipped it open, smoothed the page with her hand, and said, "There are 4 things I need from a partner. Not expectations, exactly. Let's call them non-negotiables. I sipped my cappuccino and tried to smile, but something shifted in my chest. I didn't know yet whether it was curiosity or warning. She started with her first condition, which she called a compatibility trial. I don't believe in rushing anything, she said. So, if we were to grow close, I'd want to try living together for 6 months before making a deeper commitment. That wasn't outrageous. Unusual, yes, but not unreasonable. At our age, people don't just blend into each other's lives without bumps. A trial period could offer insight, even comfort. But then came the rest. To proceed with that, Marianne said carefully, I would require a commitment deposit, $25,000 in a joint account, to show me you're serious. She said it with the calmness of someone discussing groceries. I blinked. I'd manage the account, she continued. If things don't work out, I'd return a portion of it based on how long we lived together. Prorated, of course. It took me a few seconds to process. $25,000. Not for rent, not for emergencies, but as a kind of emotional security deposit. I wanted to believe I misunderstood. I even repeated it back to her, just to make sure. But no, she confirmed it without flinching. And suddenly, I wasn't sipping coffee anymore. I was sitting across from a woman who had just asked me to collateralize companionship. I didn't raise my voice, didn't walk out. But inside, something went quiet. Not because of the money, though that wasn't small change. It was the principle, the idea that love, or even the beginning of something tender, should come with terms and conditions. I looked out the window for a moment, at a couple walking their dog. No contracts, no checklists. Just two people side by side. I looked back at Marianne, who had already flipped to the next page of her notebook. She wasn't done. Marianne looked up from her notebook with the calm confidence of someone reciting a to-do list. Condition 2, she said, is something I call a bonding experience. I raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to laugh or brace myself. She continued, I've always dreamed of going to Napa Valley for a full month, wine tastings, vineyard tours, cozy dinners at sunset. I thought it could be the perfect backdrop for us to connect deeply, if we're serious. I nodded slowly. The idea, in theory, didn't sound half bad. A getaway, some fresh air, a break from our routines. But then she added, of course, I'd handled the planning. All you'd need to do is cover the costs. My stomach sank, not from the money itself, but from the casual expectation. She went on to describe the details: luxury accommodations, private wine tastings, a couple's massage package, even a professional photographer to capture what she called the evolution of our connection. That's when it started to feel surreal. A photo shoot, matching outfits, a slideshow of us strolling through vineyards before we've even had a second date. I offered a polite smile, but inside I was scrambling to keep up. This wasn't a bonding trip. It was a script, and I wasn't sure whether I was meant to be the leading man or just the sponsor. It wasn't that I wouldn't have wanted to treat someone. I'm not stingy, but her assumption that I would cover every detail of an extravagant vacation before even knowing whether we could spend a full day together, it rubbed against something in me, something called balance. I tried to respond thoughtfully. That sounds beautiful, I said, but quite a commitment. She tilted her head. I found that shared experiences are the quickest way to test compatibility. I thought about that. She wasn't entirely wrong, but this didn't feel like testing compatibility. It felt like passing an entrance exam. She took another sip of her tea and smiled. One more thing. The photographer I have in mind specializes in romantic storytelling. I think the vineyard at sunset would be just stunning. I nodded again, but this time it was slower, heavier, because deep down I knew something. This wasn't what I had in mind when I pictured companionship. And yet, she was already turning the page. I hadn't even finished processing the vacation request when Marianne turned the page and said calmly, "Now, about condition 3, finances." I leaned back in my chair, gently setting down my empty coffee cup. A part of me was already miles away, but I listened. "If things go well during the trial," she began, "and we decide to pursue something long-term, possibly even marriage, I'd expect to manage our household finances." She said it like she was discussing the weather. "I've always been excellent with money," she explained. "I handled the books in my therapy practice for over 20 years. I believe in structure, and that includes managing our income." "Our income?" I asked, eyebrows raised. "Yes," she nodded. "Your retirement income would go into a central account. I'd create a monthly budget, set aside savings, and allocate you a fixed personal allowance for things like hobbies or small purchases." She smiled sweetly, as if she'd just offered me a gift. "And," she added, "if you go over your allowance, no problem. You'd just take on a few extra responsibilities around the house. Dishes, laundry, errands, that sort of thing." For a moment, I thought I was back in one of those classroom role-play scenarios where students acted out economic models, except this was real, and I was the student, with no say in the syllabus. I stayed quiet, but my thoughts were racing. I'd worked for 38 years, paid off my house, managed my budget, not extravagantly, not recklessly, just responsibly, quietly, on my own terms. And now, after one coffee and a notepad, someone I had known for under 2 hours was telling me she would take over my financial life and put me on an allowance. It wasn't even the money, really. It was the message that my independence, something I'd carefully rebuilt after losing my wife, could be bartered away in exchange for companionship. I didn't say anything, not yet. I was trying to be fair. Maybe this was her way of feeling safe. Maybe she had been hurt or misled in the past. Maybe this structure brought her peace. But to me, it felt like a job offer, one where love was managed like a ledger and freedom was deducted monthly. Then she flipped to the final page, and I realized we still weren't done. By now, Marianne's list felt less like a roadmap to companionship and more like a contract negotiation. Still, I gave her the benefit of the doubt. "What's the fourth?" I asked gently, though I was bracing myself. She looked up from her notebook, her tone soft but firm. "If we were to move in together or get married," she said, "I would require us to have completely separate bedrooms, always." I waited for more. She continued, "I've lived alone for over a decade since my divorce, and I've grown very protective of my personal space. Sharing a bed, even a room, makes me feel anxious and crowded. It disrupts my sleep, and honestly, my peace." She smiled, as if this were just another harmless preference, another bullet point. And to be fair, on its own, it wasn't unreasonable. I know couples who sleep in separate rooms and are perfectly happy, but context is everything. This wasn't a conversation about comfort. It was another non-negotiable, presented with the same finality as a legal clause. What unsettled me wasn't the separate rooms. It was the pattern. Every condition was about control, not connection. There was no us, no flexibility, no curiosity about what I might need, just an architecture of how I'd be expected to fit into her version of a relationship. First, a $25,000 deposit. Then, an expensive bonding trip, paid in full. Then, handing over my income and accepting an allowance. And now, a closed door, literally between us, at all times. I thought back to my marriage, to evenings with my wife, the simple rituals, her reading in bed while I made tea, falling asleep to the sound of her breath. No rules, no contracts. Just life, shared. What Marianne was describing didn't sound like companionship. It sounded like a merger, with her as the managing director and me as the buy-in. She paused, finally, and looked at me. "That's it," she said. "Those are my 4 non-negotiables." I smiled, politely, and thanked her for her honesty. But in my heart, I already knew. This wasn't the new chapter I'd hoped for. It was the end of the meeting, and the beginning of a deeper understanding. When Marianne finished her list, she looked at me with a hopeful expression, as if waiting for approval, or perhaps even admiration. But I wasn't sure what to say. I glanced down at my empty coffee cup and gave myself a moment. Not to stall, but to feel what I was feeling. Not what I was supposed to say, but what I truly believed. And what I believed, deep down, was that we were standing on opposite ends of a bridge that had never been built. I cleared my throat and said gently, "Thank you for being so honest, Marianne. I really mean that." She smiled, but her eyes searched my face. "You've clearly thought through what you need, and I respect that. But I don't think I'm the person who can meet those expectations, at least not in a way that feels healthy for me." Her smile faded slightly. Then she gave a polite nod and said, "I understand." No anger, no guilt, just 2 people realizing they weren't the right fit. I stood up slowly, slid my chair back in, and offered a handshake. She took it. I told her I had another appointment that afternoon. Not a lie exactly, an appointment with myself. As I walked out of Maple and Pine, the warm California sunlight greeted me like an old friend. And with each step away from that cafe, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that I had listened to my gut. Sadness that something I'd hoped for, a second chance at connection, had turned into a checklist of compromises. When I got home, I didn't turn on the TV or the radio. I just sat on the porch, a cup of chamomile tea in hand, and let the quiet wrap around me like a familiar blanket. And the more I sat there, the more one thought rose above the rest. Peace is worth protecting, even if it means walking away from someone who looks good on paper, but doesn't feel right in your heart. Over the next few days, I found myself replaying that meeting more than I expected. Not with regret, but with curiosity. I kept asking myself, what was I really hoping for when I reached out to Marianne? And the answer was simple. Connection, not control, not contracts, not conditions written in ink before we even knew how we laughed together. I didn't need a fantasy vacation. I didn't need a financial manager. I didn't need a second adolescence with scheduled intimacy and curated photo shoots. What I needed was someone who saw me, not as a provider, not as a placeholder, but as a human being, aging, yes, but still full of stories, humor, flaws, and quiet kindness. There's a certain vulnerability that comes with dating later in life. You're not as quick to trust, but you still long for warmth. You carry your history with you, losses, lessons, and the invisible weight of starting over. And that's why I'm proud of how I handled it. Because in another time, maybe a decade ago, I might have stayed longer, tried harder, told myself I was being too picky or too sensitive. But now I know what peace costs, and I know what it's worth. Walking away wasn't failure, it was clarity. It reminded me that I don't have to compromise the life I've built to let someone in. If it's the right connection, it will feel like addition, not subtraction. Marianne wasn't cruel. She was clear about what she wanted. But that didn't make it right for me. And that's okay. Because not every conversation is meant to lead to love. Some are meant to lead us back to ourselves. If you're still watching, Tim, or listening, thank you. I didn't expect to share this story, but the truth is, I know I'm not the only one. There are so many of us out here, quietly navigating this new season of life. Some of us are widowed, some divorced, some simply lonely in a way we didn't see coming. And we all carry questions. Am I too set in my ways? Will I ever feel that spark again? Am I foolish for even trying? Here's what I'll say. From one soul to another. You are not foolish. You are brave. It takes courage to open your heart again. It takes strength to admit you still want companionship, even after the world thinks you've settled in. And it takes wisdom to walk away when something doesn't feel right, no matter how long it's been since you've had someone to walk beside. What I learned from meeting Marianne wasn't about dating rules or red flags. I learned about me, what I value, what I won't negotiate, and just how far I've come in protecting the peace I worked hard to find. Companionship, when it's right, should feel like two chairs on the same porch. No contracts, no performance, just presence. So if you're stepping back into the world of connection, take your time, trust your instincts, and don't ever hand over your worth in exchange for someone else's conditions, because peace, your peace, is the most expensive thing you own. And let me tell you something I believe with my whole heart. You are not too old to be loved the right way, but you are absolutely too wise to be loved the wrong way. Take care of yourself, speak kindly to yourself, and if the right person does come along, they won't ask you to shrink, sacrifice, or sign a checklist. They'll just be glad you said hello. Thanks for spending this time with me. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Until then, be well, be at peace, and don't ever forget you're worth a quiet, honest kind of love.